Imagine a world where a single sermon could ignite a revolution or tear a community asunder. In the 1740s, the American colonies were already a battlefield of the soul. In the meeting houses, a fire was beginning to roar, one that pitted the cold intellectual rigor of traditionalists like John Thompson against the white-hot emotional fervor of revivalists like Gilbert Tennant. This was not merely a debate over church rules. It was a fundamental clash over what it meant to be human in the presence of the divine. Was God found in the disciplined study of ancient creeds or in the sudden shattering experience of a transformed heart? As we look back at the Great Schism of 1741, we discover that the cracks formed in those colonial floorboards would eventually become the fault lines of the American character itself. The history of American Presbyterianism is not merely a record of ecclesiastical growth, but a turbulent saga of identity formation through internal conflict. Among the most definitive of these ruptures was the old side, new side schism. This was a collision between the institutional order of the Scottish Reformation and the vital religion sparked by William Tennant's Log College. On one side stood a commitment to confessional stability. On the other was a burgeoning hunger for experiential piety, fueled by the itinerant preaching of George Whitefield and the First Great Awakening. The tension between these two poles, the objective standards of the creed and the subjective fire of the heart, would not only split the Presbyterian Church in 1741, but would establish the primary fault lines for American Protestantism for centuries to come. The arrival of Presbyterianism was characterized by a struggle to replicate Old World structures in a vast frontier. When Francis Mukimi planted the first roots in the 1690s, the blueprint was a disciplined system modeled after the Church of Scotland. The architects sought to gather immigrants under a centralized authority to provide doctrinal uniformity. However, geographical and demographic realities immediately undermined this ideal. The central complication was the scarcity of trained clergy. The original intent relied on a steady stream of ministers from Scotland and Ireland, but the burdens of recruitment forced a pivot toward domestic talent. The integration of New England graduates introduced a chemical change. These men brought Congregationalist sensibilities and a pietist emphasis on the individual's spiritual state over central hierarchy. A denomination committed to a rigid Scottish hierarchy was being staffed by a more flexible New England tradition. The machinery remained Scottish, but the spirit within the gears was becoming increasingly American and pluralistic. If the New England influence was a subtle breeze, the emergence of the Log College was a gale force wind. In 1735, William Tennant established a theological school in Neshaminy, Pennsylvania. To traditionalists, this log college appeared to be a makeshift institution that threatened the ministry. In reality, it was a revolutionary laboratory for a new kind of leadership. The legacy was vast. Graduates replicated Tennant's model, founding their own regional schools and creating a self-sustaining ecosystem of new side thought. The impact extended into the burgeoning American identity. Benjamin Rush, a future signer of the Declaration of Independence, carried the Log College's emphasis on principled descent into the political sphere. These spiritual elites valued the authentication of the Spirit over the licensure of the synod. To the old side, this wasn't progress. It was a recipe for anarchy. The stage was set for a confrontation. The methodology of ministerial preparation had shifted from institutional certification to spiritual vitality, a shift the established synod found alien and deeply threatening. The divergence between the old side and new side was not merely a dispute over administrative protocol, it was a profound disagreement regarding the essence of spiritual legitimacy. At its heart lay a conflict between confessionalism, the belief that the church is preserved through objective standards, and pietism, which prioritizes the subjective transformative experience. For the old side, led by figures like Robert Cross, the survival of the church in the American wilderness depended upon the maintenance of rigid, unyielding standards. They viewed the Westminster Confession not as a flexible guideline, but as a vital fortress wall protecting the flock from heresy and enthusiasm. Their strategy involved strict mechanisms of control, enforcing the adopting act for all candidates and centralizing committee control to bypass revivalist schools. When the New Brunswick Presbytery defied this authority by ordaining J. Rowlandson in 1739, the old side utilized the power of the synod to issue a formal censure. Cross feared that the itinerant preaching of figures like George Whitefield would lead to social disorder. To the old side, a valid minister was defined by education and doctrinal submission. In contrast, the new side believed a church could be doctrinally correct yet spiritually dead. Led by Gilbert Tennant, they argued that intellectual assent to a creed was insufficient. The new side's revolutionary requirement was the conversion experience. They contended that a minister must provide evidence of a vital encounter with God. Tennant and his followers feared that many established pulpits were occupied by the unconverted. They advocated for more rigorous standards for admission to the Lord's table. While they still valued education, they believed the Holy Spirit could work through unconventional means, which the old side dismissed as faddish or disorderly. To the new side, the church existed for the salvation of souls through an immediate work of God. This priority made synodical rules feel like bureaucratic hurdles, setting the stage for an inevitable institutional rupture. The simmering tensions of the 1730s reached a boiling point with the arrival of the English evangelist George Whitefield in 1739. Whitefield served as the human catalyst that forced both sides to move beyond theoretical debates into open conflict. Whitefield introduced a style of ministry that bypassed traditional liturgical structures. His preaching was characterized by immense emotional fervor. Under Whitefield's influence, conversion was no longer viewed exclusively as a lifelong process. Instead, it became an instantaneous event, a crisis moment of conviction and relief. It was common for hearers to weep, shriek, or faint. While the new side interpreted these as signs of genuine conviction, the old side saw them as dangerous psychological instability. For those swept up in the revival, the personal experience of God's grace became the primary mark of a Christian, often superseding liturgy, creed, or church polity. Whitefield's popularity forced the Presbyterian Church to grapple with the actual meaning of the Adopting Act of 1729. The dispute was whether subscription to the standards required a strict, literal adherence or allowed for system flexibility. The Scotch-Irish interpretation insisted on strict subscription, allowing no exceptions except for minor points regarding the civil magistrate. Ministers from New England backgrounds argued for a more flexible approach, emphasizing the essential doctrines over every specific phrase of the confession. This disagreement created a permanent hermeneutic of suspicion. The old side suspected the new side of being closet Congregationalists, masking a lack of rigor. Meanwhile, the new side suspected the old side of using the confession as a weapon to silence the work of the Spirit. The years leading up to 1741 saw the transformation of theological disagreement into an all-out ecclesiastical war. The friction was no longer localized. It had become a systemic crisis where the very definition of church authority was at stake. The absolute turning point in the conflict was a sermon preached in March 1740 by Gilbert Tennant titled "The Danger of an Unconverted Ministry." This was not a nuanced theological treatise. It was an incendiary broadside. In this discourse, Tennant argued that many of the old side ministers were like the Pharisees of Jesus' time. He described them as men who possessed the outward credentials of religion but lacked the inward life of the Spirit. The how of this provocation was particularly stinging. Tennant encouraged congregants to abandon their own dead ministers to seek out vital preaching elsewhere. This was a direct assault on the concept of parochial order. In the 18th century mind, the bond between a pastor and his flock was a sacred legal and spiritual contract. By suggesting that parishioners had a divine right to desert a graceless pastor, Tennant was not just criticizing individuals, he was dismantling the structural integrity of the Presbyterian system. To the old side, this was the height of enthusiasm and a path toward total ecclesiastical anarchy. The old side-dominated Synod of Philadelphia did not remain passive. They viewed the new side's itinerancy as a disorderly violation of the church's constitution. To curb this, the Synod enacted several measures. They formally banned ministers from preaching outside their own presbytery boundaries without an invitation. They sought to codify the requirement that all ministers must be approved by the Synod's Central Committee, specifically to weed out those who prioritized revivalism over order. The rationale behind these moves was the preservation of peace and unity. From the old side perspective, they were not the aggressors, they were the defenders of a house being set on fire by radicals. They believed that without these rules, the church would dissolve into a collection of independent, competing personality cults. The structural integrity of the house was failing. The year 1741 was no longer a date on the calendar. It was a looming, inevitable breaking point. The tension finally snapped during the meeting of the Synod of Philadelphia in May 1741. The events of this gathering represent one of the most dramatic moments in American colonial history. The catalyst for the split was a formal document known as the Protestation, presented by Robert Cross and signed by several Old Side ministers. The Protestation was an ultimatum. It argued that the new side had forfeited their right to sit in the synod because of their subversive practices and their refusal to submit to synodical authority. The execution of the actual split was more of a walkout than a formal trial. When it became clear that the old side held the majority and would no longer tolerate the dissenters, the members of the New Brunswick Presbytery, led by the tenants, withdrew from the meeting. This was not a mutual agreement to disagree, it was an acrimonious divorce. For 4 years, the new side operated in a state of institutional limbo. However, the movement was growing too fast to remain unorganized. In 1745, they joined with the Presbytery of New York to form the Synod of New York, often called the New Side Synod. This new body was founded on a fundamentally different philosophy. They allowed flexibility over formality. They put a priority on missionary zeal. The New Side Synod became a powerhouse for evangelism, focusing on the frontiers and the southern colonies. In these areas, the old side's rigid requirements for settled pastorates made growth difficult, while the new side flourished in the expansion. They enacted the vital mandate. The primary purpose of the New York Synod was the promotion of the Great Awakening. They viewed their separation as a liberation from the dead weight of traditionalism that they believed was stifling the American church. The Schism of 1741 was thus a victory for pluralism. It demonstrated that institutional unity could not be maintained at the expense of individual spiritual conviction. The two sides would remain separate for 17 years, creating two parallel versions of Presbyterianism. One focused on the preservation of the past in Philadelphia, and the other focused on the conversion of the future in New York. The 17-year estrangement between the Synod of Philadelphia and the Synod of New York was ultimately unsustainable. External pressures, specifically the French and Indian War, fostered a renewed desire for solidarity. The reason behind the reunion was rooted in a pragmatic realization: a house divided could not effectively evangelize the rapidly expanding American frontier. The reconciliation was made possible by a mutual shift in priorities. The old side realized their rigid order led to stagnation. The new side realized the need for order. The radicalism of Gilbert Tennant's earlier years had been replaced by a more sober appreciation for the necessity of church order and the dangers of unchecked enthusiasm. The formulation of the diplomatic breakthrough involved a strategic compromise regarding the Adopting Act. In 1758, the two bodies merged to form the Synod of New York and Philadelphia. The terms were carefully crafted. The new side agreed to a more formal subscription to the Westminster standards, acknowledging them as a necessary safeguard for truth. The old side conceded that a candidate's spiritual experience was a legitimate concern for the presbytery, effectively validating the core principle of the Log College. The reunion created a robust framework that combined the Scottish emphasis on order with the American emphasis on mission. While the reunion was legally a merger of equals, the ideological momentum clearly favored the new side. By 1758, the New Side ministers outnumbered the Old Side nearly 3-1. The Union absorbed the Old Side into a more expansive evangelical Presbyterianism. This synthesized identity would go on to found the College of New Jersey, later Princeton University, as a premier center for both academic excellence and spiritual fervor. They proved that the two ideals of academic rigor and spiritual vitality were not mutually exclusive. The synthesis of the Great Awakening and the Westminster tradition created a uniquely American Presbyterianism that could withstand the coming revolution. The victory was one of balance, the preservation of the faith's foundations through the fire of personal transformation. The schism was healed, but the church that emerged was fundamentally changed, ready to shape the moral and spiritual landscape of a new nation. The union was complete. Order and vitality had found their common ground. The Old Side, New Side schism set a precedent for the boom and bust cycle of American Presbyterianism. It established a recurring pattern where the tension between tradition and transformation leads to rupture. The echoes of the 1741 split were heard again in the early 19th century during the Second Great Awakening. The Cumberland Presbyterian Schism of 1810 mirrored the original conflict with eerie precision. Once again, the substance of the division involved the requirements for ministerial education and the validity of revivalist fervor. Frontier presbyteries, desperate for ministers to serve the exploding population, began ordaining men who lacked formal classical training. These men expressed reservations about the Westminster Confession's view of predestination. The established Old Guard reacted with the same institutional rigor as the Old Side of 1741. This led to the formation of the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, confirming that the American frontier would always be a site of tension between the standards of the East and the spirit of the West. The most massive repetition of the pattern occurred in 1837 with the Old School, New School division. This was essentially Old Side versus New Side on a grander national scale. The Old School, descendants of the Old Side, emphasized strict confessionalism and traditional Presbyterian polity. The New School embraced social reform movements and favored the revivalist techniques of Charles Finney, prioritizing the essential spirit of the gospel over the letter of the confession. This split lasted until 1869, but it demonstrated that the fundamental questions of the 1740s remained the central fault lines of the denomination. The fractures of the 1930s can also be traced back to the seeds planted in the Old Side, New Side era. The 1936 formation of the Orthodox Presbyterian Church was a defense of confessional integrity. This was a modern iteration of the Old Side's protective instinct against perceived theological liberalism. Similarly, the 1973 formation of the Presbyterian Church in America represented a break from a body that many felt had abandoned vital biblical Christianity. The 1741 schism provided the blueprint for every subsequent crisis, the battle between the preservation of the institution and the experience of the individual. The result is a landscape of pluralism, a collection of bodies that each claim a piece of the original 18th century synthesis. The fault lines remain, proving that the struggle for the heart of the church is a permanent feature of the American Presbyterian identity. The saga of the Old Side and New Side is more than a historical footnote. It is the foundational narrative of American Presbyterianism. The schism taught the church that institutional unity is fragile without experiential religion. The reunion taught that revivalist fervor requires institutional order to survive. The tension between the Log College and the Synod persists in every modern debate over worship styles, ordination standards, and the role of the church in the public square. By unpacking the reason of their dissent and the how of their reconciliation, we see a mirror of the American religious character, a restless search for a faith that is both intellectually rigorous and spiritually alive. The fractured fold of 1741 did not destroy Presbyterianism. It forged it into a dynamic, if often divided, force that shaped the very soul of a new nation. The history of the Old Side and New Side is more than a chronicle of past disputes. It is a mirror held up to our own spiritual and communal lives. As we consider the delicate balance between institutional order and personal fervor, we are invited to examine where our own loyalties lie. By looking backward at these 18th century pioneers, we gain the clarity needed to navigate the complexities of faith in the modern world. Take a moment to sit with the weight of this history and consider how these ancient echoes still resonate in your own heart today. In your own spiritual journey, do you find more stability in the old side commitment to tradition and structure, or do you resonate more with the new side emphasis on experience? Is it possible for an institution to maintain strict standards without losing its vital fire, or is some degree of tension between the two inevitable? How can we distinguish between healthy spiritual passion and the disorderly enthusiasm that the old side so feared in the colonial era? Our exploration of theological turning points is far from over. Join us next week as we pivot to the broader New England landscape to discuss the old light versus new light controversy. We will dive into how this parallel struggle reshaped the Congregationalist tradition and influenced the intellectual architecture of early America. If you want to continue unpacking the why and the how behind the most pivotal moments in church history, make sure to subscribe to Theology today. Click the subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of our journey through the depths of theological thought. Join us next time.